Cut the lock. That was the first thing I heard, Karen Whitmore's shrill voice echoing across my front field like a siren. The sound of metal snapping rang out as a group of people in neon vests and sunglasses stormed through my front gate under the blazing midday Sunday. 3 trucks with HOA patrol painted on the doors blocked my driveway like I was some kind of criminal. Cameras rolled. Clipboard-wielding neighbors barked orders. Dust filled the air. I dropped my wrench, walked slowly to the porch, and watched them trample across my property as if it belonged to them. Karen, red-faced and shaking with self-righteous fury, pointed straight at me and yelled, "This area is under HOA inspection. I didn't move." I just smirked and said quietly, "You sure you're in the right jurisdiction?" Because just 50 feet away behind the barn door, the county sheriff himself was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping his coffee, unaware that a suburban mob had just broken into his jurisdiction. Before we jump into this unbelievable showdown, comment where you're watching from, tell me the time in your area, and make sure to subscribe. You'll want to see how this one ends. Most people think living next to an HOA community means peace, order, and tidy lawns. I used to think that too, until I met Karen Whitmore. I bought my land 15 years ago. 20 acres of quiet country, just beyond the boundary line of a fancy suburban development called Cypress Ridge Estates. I built my own farmhouse, a red barn, planted corn, and raised a few horses. Life was simple. I had the freedom to live the way I wanted, no board meetings, no HOA dues, and definitely no one telling me what color my mailbox should be. But Karen had other ideas. She moved into the subdivision about 4 years ago and immediately became president of the HOA. You know the type, crisp blazers, clipboard always in hand, convinced she was the law of the land. The woman was like a cross between a traffic cop and a dictator with a Pinterest account. The first time she came to my property line, she complained that my horses smelled offensive to the community. I politely told her, "Ma'am, this is a farm. The smell you're detecting is called nature." That didn't go over well. From that day on, she made it her personal mission to bring me under control. I got letters stuffed in my mailbox accusing me of unauthorized livestock and improper landscaping. One even said I was violating community visual standards because my barn wasn't painted beige to match the houses in the HOA. Beige. Can you imagine painting a working barn beige? Every week, a new envelope appeared. All signed by HOA Enforcement Committee, which was just a fancy way of saying Karen and her friends with too much time. At first I ignored it. Then she started mailing fake fines printed from a home office, complete with an official seal she probably made on Canva. I called the county clerk's office, and they laughed. My land had been zoned agricultural for 50 years, long before that HOA even existed. I was completely outside their jurisdiction. I could build a 10-story chicken coop if I wanted, and Karen couldn't do a thing about it. But she didn't like hearing no. She doubled down. Showed up one morning with 2 of her HOA patrolmen to take photos of my fence and claim it was non-compliant. I told them politely to leave, or I'd call the sheriff. They laughed, probably thinking I was bluffing. That was the day I actually did call him. Sheriff Tom Brown, my old friend from high school, showed up 20 minutes later. Tom and I had been through a lot together. He joined law enforcement. I went into construction, then retired early and built this farm. He was the kind of man who believed in fairness and the law, not neighborhood politics. When he pulled up that day, the look on Karen's face was priceless. She tried to talk circles around him, waving HOA documents in his face. Tom calmly read them, handed them back, and said, "Ma'am, this isn't worth the paper it's printed on." From that moment on, Karen considered him my co-conspirator. Weeks went by, and I thought maybe she'd finally drop it. But Karen was a woman who needed control. If she couldn't have it, she'd create chaos instead. She started spreading rumors around the neighborhood, telling people I was running an illegal salvage yard, storing hazardous waste, or worse, growing something illegal behind my barn. Some neighbors believed her, others didn't. But she had a following, a little HOA army of people who liked feeling important. Then, one Friday morning, she made her biggest mistake. Sheriff Brown called me, said he needed a quiet place to stay for the weekend. He was running a small county investigation involving stolen construction equipment, and my farm was the perfect hideout to park an unmarked vehicle for a few days. I didn't ask questions. I trusted him. We set up a cot in the guest house beside my barn, and he told me he'd be laying low, doing paperwork, maybe checking the area for suspicious activity. That same afternoon, I saw Karen driving by, slowing her car down at my front gate, taking photos like she was on a mission. I had no idea that in her mind this was the final straw. She must have seen the sheriff's unmarked SUV and thought she'd found proof of her imaginary crimes. The next day, a notice was taped to my gate, "Emergency HOA safety." Inspection will be conducted immediately. Failure to cooperate may result in legal action. Legal action? From an HOA that didn't even govern my land. I actually laughed out loud. But something in me said, don't take this lightly. Karen wasn't just annoying, she was dangerous when she felt powerful. So I did what I always do before a storm. I prepared. I checked all my perimeter cameras, made sure my security system was recording, and charged the backup batteries. I even set one camera facing the main gate zoomed out wide so it would catch everything just in case she actually tried something. Sheriff Brown saw the message on my gate that evening and chuckled. "She's really asking for trouble, Mike," he said, sipping coffee on my porch. "Yeah," I replied, "but this time she might just get it." We talked for a while about old times, how we used to fix up cars, the dumb stuff we did as teenagers. It was strange sitting there with the quiet of the fields all around us, knowing trouble was on the horizon, but not quite believing it would really come. But it did. The following morning, just past noon, I heard the unmistakable sound of engines. Multiple engines. I looked up from the workbench in my barn and saw a convoy of white trucks kicking up dust down the dirt road. The HOA patrol had arrived in full suburban glory. Each truck had the Cypress Ridge HOA emblem stuck on the door like it meant something. Men in reflective vests jumped out, holding clipboards, walkie-talkies, and cameras. And in the front seat of the lead vehicle was Karen Whitmore, sitting tall, her lipstick bright enough to be seen from 50 yards away. Sheriff Brown was inside the guest house, quietly reviewing some paperwork. He had no idea what was happening outside. I stepped out to the porch, feeling that familiar burn of frustration in my chest, but also curiosity. What was her endgame this time? She couldn't sue me, couldn't find me. So what did she think this little parade was going to accomplish? The trucks screeched to a halt. Karen stepped out, holding a binder thicker than a Bible. "Mr. Thompson," she shouted across the field, "this is an official HOA safety inspection." I could see the neighbors gathering along the fence line, pulling out their phones, watching the drama unfold in the hot afternoon Sunday. My dogs barked from the backyard. The wind picked up. That's when I realized something. She didn't come for a conversation, she came for a show. She wanted to humiliate me publicly, to make an example out of the man who refused to bow to the HOA. I leaned against the porch railing, wiped the sweat from my brow, and smiled faintly. "You're trespassing, Karen," I said, calm and steady. She ignored me, turning to her patrol team. "Record this. We're documenting evidence of non-compliance." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because in just a few minutes, she was about to find out that the one person she'd just challenged wasn't me, it was the law itself. If there's one thing I learned about Karen Whitmore, it's that she couldn't stand to lose. The woman could turn a bird feeder into a federal case if it didn't fit community standards. And now that I'd ignored her phony inspection notices, she'd gone full crusader mode. After that embarrassing standoff by my fence, I thought she might cool down. Maybe she'd realize she had no jurisdiction and move on. But I underestimated how much she loved control and how far she'd go to get it back. 2 days later, my neighbor Linda, one of the few sane people left in that HOA, stopped by while I was feeding the horses. She looked uneasy. "Mike," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder, "you should know that Karen's holding some kind of emergency meeting at her house tonight. She says it's about you." I laughed. "About me? What now? Am I violating their sunshine quota?" Linda didn't smile. "She's talking about sending in the patrol team. She said you're hiding something on your property. She even mentioned calling Channel 6 News." That made me pause. "She's serious," Linda nodded. "Dead serious. She said she's going to expose your illegal activities for the good of the community." I thanked her and watched as she hurried back down the dirt road. My mind turned slowly. I wasn't too worried. HOA patrols weren't law enforcement, they were just a bunch of retirees in polos pretending to be special agents. But the problem wasn't their power, it was their arrogance. They genuinely believed they were doing something righteous. And a mob with a cause, even a stupid one, can get dangerous fast. That evening, the sun dipped low over the fields. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch swing, thinking. Through the trees, I could faintly hear laughter and voices coming from the direction of Karen's house. She was probably standing there in her living room, waving around fake documents and getting everyone riled up. I imagined her speech. "If the county won't act, we will. We're the protectors of this community. We can't let this outsider ignore our rules." And they'd all clap, cheering like she'd just declared independence from the United States. By the next morning, I had confirmation of her plan. A local delivery guy who'd seen me often stopped by with a package and said, "Hey, you got some kind of HOA army loading up trucks this morning. Looked like they were headed your way." I smiled. "Perfect." He frowned. Perfect, yeah, I said, sipping my coffee. They're about to learn a lesson in boundaries. Because what Karen didn't know was that Sheriff Brown, still staying in my guest house, had told me earlier that week he was investigating a money laundering operation connected to a certain HOA treasurer. The case was confidential, but he needed a quiet spot to stay while tracking some suspicious transactions. When I mentioned the HOA next door, he raised an eyebrow. Cypress Ridge Estates, yeah, I said. You know them, he smirked. Let's just say their treasurer's name came up in a few reports. But don't worry, Mike, I'm just keeping an eye on things. So while Karen was plotting her inspection, the county sheriff was literally sitting 50 feet away from her target, working on a case that could implicate her own HOA board. Irony doesn't get better than that. That afternoon, I decided to get ready for the visit. I spent a good hour checking my security cameras, repositioning a few for better angles. I wanted full coverage of the driveway, the gate, and the front yard. I knew they'd probably record everything for their own evidence, but I planned to have my own version crystal clear in 4 kelvins. Sheriff Brown stepped out of the guest house just as I finished. He was in jeans and a plain shirt, no badge in sight, but his presence carried quiet authority. You expecting company? He asked. Something like that, I said, grinning. He looked at me for a moment, then shook his head. You've got that look, Mike. The same one you had when we pranked Principal Harris in high school. This time it's legal, I said. Mostly. He chuckled, then went back inside to review his files. By noon, I heard the faint buzz of gossip floating through town. Someone had leaked Karen's mission. Apparently she'd formed a special committee for immediate property compliance. In plain English, that meant 4 HOA members, 3 cameras, and a couple of cheap radios. They were going to march right onto my land and document violations for their so-called record. Karen loved titles that made her sound official. She probably spent all night designing new badges for her little squad. Still, I knew she wouldn't move without an audience. She wanted this to be public. She wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone. So I waited. The next morning, the farm was peaceful again. Sunlight spilled over the fields, and the dew on the grass shimmered like glass. I took my time doing chores, mending a gate, brushing down one of the horses, feeding the chickens. I wasn't worried. I dealt with worse storms. Then around lunchtime, my phone buzzed. A neighbor texted, Karen's leading a group to your property right now. She's got cameras. Looks serious. I smiled to myself and replied, thanks. I'll have coffee ready. From the barn, I could hear the faint rumble of engines. I wiped my hands on my jeans, stepped out into the sunlight, and saw a cloud of dust rising down the road. They were coming. 3 white pickup trucks, all freshly washed, with HOA logos taped to the doors like they were part of some law enforcement convoy. The sight was so ridiculous I nearly laughed out loud. The lead truck stopped right at my front gate, tires crunching over gravel. Karen stepped out in full glory, white blazer, sunglasses, clipboard in hand, lips pursed into that familiar look of superiority. Behind her were her patrolmen, Stan, her husband, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent sunburn, Don, a retired security guard who took everything too seriously, and Marv, a self-proclaimed community volunteer who filmed everything on his phone. Karen pointed dramatically at the lock on my gate. That's a clear violation of community access codes. I raised an eyebrow. Community access, Karen, this isn't a park, it's private property. She smirked. We'll see what the board has to say about that. I crossed my arms, calm and patient. Karen, for the 100th time, I'm not part of your HOA. She turned to her little crew, ignoring me completely. All right, gentlemen, record this for documentation. If he refuses compliance, we proceed with inspection. The cameras started rolling. I could feel my temper rise, but I didn't move. Instead, I let her dig her own hole. Every word, every action captured perfectly on my cameras. Stan approached the gate holding a pair of bolt cutters. We've got orders, ma'am, he said, glancing at Karen. Cut it, she snapped. And just like that, he did. The metal clamped, twisted, and snapped with a loud clang. The lock fell to the dirt. Karen turned back to me, triumph gleaming in her eyes. This property is now under official HOA inspection. I looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. Is that so? She mistook my calm for fear. You can cooperate or we can escalate this matter to the authorities, she threatened. I raised an eyebrow. Funny you mention authorities. From the guest house, I could see the shadow of movement through the window. Sheriff Brown had heard the commotion. He stepped closer to the door, curious. The sound of gravel crunching under boots filled the air as the HOA patrol marched toward my barn like it was a crime scene. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but I held it in. The real show was about to begin, and Karen had no idea her little inspection was about to turn into a full-blown police investigation. I leaned against the porch rail, calm as ever. "All right, Karen," I said, my voice even. "Let's see how far you're willing to go today." The sun blazed overhead, cameras rolled, and the sheriff's hand reached quietly for his badge inside the house. The moment those bolt cutters sliced through the lock, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger either. It was the kind of quiet fury that comes when you know exactly what's about to happen and you're ready to let it unfold. Karen Whitmore, queen of the HOA, stepped forward like she was leading a military raid. Her heels clicked against the dirt road, her white blazer glowing under the harsh noon Sunday. Behind her, her HOA patrol strutted in formation, clipboards in one hand, cameras in the other, recording every move, as if they were about to uncover a crime scene. "Spread out," she barked, waving her manicured hand. "Check the barn, check the sheds, document everything. He's been operating illegally for months." Stan, her husband, puffed up his chest and started toward the barn. "Copy that, ma'am," he said, trying to sound like a real officer. I didn't move. I just leaned on the porch railing, coffee cup in hand, and watched the circus roll onto my land. "Karen," I said evenly, "I'd tell you to stop, but honestly, this is too entertaining." She turned, her eyes blazing behind her sunglasses. "You think this is a joke? You've ignored every notice, every citation, every request from the board." I smiled. "That's because your HOA doesn't exist here." She ignored me and signaled to Don, the ex-security guard, to start filming the barn. He raised his phone like he was capturing footage for a crime documentary. They stomped through the yard, muttering to each other, pointing at my tractors, my water tanks, my fence posts. I heard Stan say, "Looks like unpermitted structures, all of it." I couldn't help but chuckle. "You do realize I called out your trespassing on private land, right? That's an actual crime, unlike your made-up ones." Karen spun around, her expression twisted with indignation. "We have authority. You can't keep hiding behind your paperwork, authority," I said softly. "You're an HOA president, not the National Guard." A few of the neighbors had gathered along the fence line by then. Phones came out. People whispered. Even from a distance, I could see the mixture of amusement and disbelief on their faces. Karen noticed too, and that only made her more determined to perform. "Stan," she shouted, "get that side gate open. We'll inspect the barn first." I tilted my head slightly toward the barn, where the big double doors were shut tight. "You might want to think twice about that," I said, but of course she didn't listen. Stan grabbed the latch, gave it a yank, locked. He turned to Karen. "It's secured." "Then cut it," she snapped, her voice sharp as a whip. He hesitated. "Karen, maybe we should," I said. "Cut it, Stan." He sighed and lifted the bolt cutters again. The sun caught the steel glinting off the blades as he positioned them around the latch. That was when the barn door creaked open from the inside. The entire patrol froze. Standing in the doorway, backlit by sunlight pouring through the rafters, was Sheriff Tom Brown, 6'2", broad-shouldered, and wearing his full county uniform. His badge gleamed in the light. The gold letters "County Sheriff" glinted off his chest like a warning sign from heaven itself. For a full 5 seconds, no one said a word. Then Karen blinked. Who are you?" He stepped forward, calm but firm. "Sheriff Brown, ma'am, county law enforcement. And you are trespassing." Karen's face went pale. "Trespassing?" No, we're conducting an inspection." Brown raised an eyebrow. "Inspection? Under what authority?" she stammered. "Under HOA regulations." "This property is in violation of." He cut her off, his voice low but steady. "Ma'am, this property is not under your HOA. It's private land outside your jurisdiction. You and your associates have forcibly entered without permission, damaged private property, and disrupted the peace. That's criminal trespass." Stan dropped the bolt cutters immediately. Don lowered his camera. Marv, the volunteer, looked like he wanted to disappear. Karen, though, she tried to recover her composure. "This doesn't concern the county sheriff. This is HOA business." Sheriff Brown tilted his head. "When you break a lock on someone's property, it becomes my business." I was doing everything I could not to grin. I leaned casually against the porch post, enjoying every second. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to regain control. I demand you stay out of HOA matters." Brown took one slow step forward. "And I demand you and your patrol team stop committing felonies in broad daylight." He lifted his radio and pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Brown. I've got a group of unauthorized individuals on private property, possible vandalism and trespass. Send a unit to County Road 12 West Farmgate." The color drained completely from Karen's face. "You're calling for backup for us," Ma'am Brown said, looking her dead in the eye. "You broke into someone's land with bolt cutters. What did you think was going to happen, a ribbon-cutting ceremony?" A ripple of laughter broke out among the neighbors behind the fence. I saw a few people holding up their phones, capturing every second. The mighty HOA patrol cornered on camera under the bright afternoon sun by the very law they thought they controlled. Karen's voice wavered. "This is ridiculous. We're just protecting our community." Brown nodded slowly. "And I'm protecting mine." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that presses against your chest. Even the wind had gone still. Then in the distance came the faint sound of sirens. Karen's head snapped toward the road. Two black and white county cruisers were speeding down the gravel lane, kicking up dust. The deputies stepped out as they arrived, one hand on their belts, their expressions serious. Brown gestured toward the group. "Gentlemen, these fine folks decided to take the law into their own hands." One deputy walked up to Stan and said, "Sir, do you have any identification?" Stan's hands were shaking as he fumbled for his wallet. "We were just following orders." "Whose orders?" Stan hesitated, then looked at his wife. Karen didn't answer. I could see the sweat trickling down her neck as she realized her perfect plan was unraveling in front of an audience and in front of the law. Brown turned to me. "You all right, Mike?" I nodded. "Never better, Sheriff." "I was just enjoying the entertainment," he smirked. "Figured you might be." Then he turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you and your patrol to stay put while we take your statements." Karen's composure finally cracked. "This is harassment. You can't detain us. I'll have you reported." Brown raised a brow. "To who? The HOA board." That broke whatever control she had left. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff. I'll sue you and him and the county," she screamed, pointing at both of us. Brown didn't even blink. "You're welcome to try. But first you're going to explain why you thought it was acceptable to force entry onto private land without a warrant." The deputies began separating the group, taking photos of the broken lock and the tire tracks. One officer was reading Karen her rights before she even realized it. Stan, poor guy, just muttered, "I told her this was a bad idea." I leaned closer and said softly, "Next time, listen to your husband, Karen." She glared at me, eyes burning, but she didn't say another word. For once, the great Karen Whitmore had no script to follow. As the deputies collected evidence, Sheriff Brown walked over to me and handed back my broken lock. "Guess you'll need a new one," he said. I smiled. "Nah, Sheriff, that one's worth keeping. Souvenir." He laughed quietly. "Fair enough." We both stood there for a moment, watching as the HOA patrol sat on the grass under police supervision, their fake badges and clipboards confiscated. The neighbors whispered behind the fence, recording, posting, gossiping. Karen had wanted an audience, and she got one. Just not the kind she expected. The sirens faded. The heat shimmered off the road. And for the first time in months, my farm felt peaceful again. I looked over at Brown, who was scribbling notes in his pad. "You know, I said you couldn't have timed that better." He smiled. "Sometimes justice has good timing." I nodded toward Karen, still fuming under the watchful eyes of the deputies. "You think this'll finally shut her down?" He glanced at her and said quietly, "No. But it's about to get a lot worse for her, and not for the reason she thinks." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" Brown gave me a knowing look. "Let's just say this isn't only about trespassing." I didn't know it then, but that was the start of a much deeper storm, one that would blow the lid off Karen's little empire. And this time, daylight wouldn't hide a thing. If there's one thing I'll never forget, it's the look on Karen's face when she realized who she had just ordered her patrol team to confront. The moment Sheriff Brown stepped out of my barn in full uniform, her bravado collapsed faster than a folding chair in a hurricane. She froze, one heel still planted in the dirt, one hand clutching her clipboard like it was a shield. The bright afternoon sun hit the sheriff's gold badge, throwing a blinding flash across the yard. The air went dead quiet. The HOA patrol stood motionless, like kids caught sneaking cookies from the jar, except this time the jar belonged to the law. After noon, the sheriff said, his voice calm but heavy, like a man who'd seen this kind of nonsense too many times. "Mind telling me what you're doing on private land?" Karen blinked rapidly. "Private land." He gestured around us at the fences, the crops, the barn, the farmhouse. "Yes, ma'am. This land, the one you just broke into." Stan took a step back. Marv, the guy with the camera, quietly turned it off. Only Karen still stood her ground, though her face had gone several shades paler. "This property," she said, her voice trembling but defiant, "is within the community boundary lines of Cypress Ridge Estates. That gives our HOA jurisdiction under our bylaws." Sheriff Brown's eyebrows lifted just slightly. Ma'am, your bylaws don't mean a thing once you cross that fence. That there, he pointed at my wooden post with the county seal, marks the end of your jurisdiction. Everything beyond that is unincorporated county land, which means the only law that applies here is mine. Karen's jaw clenched. I've contacted the county office about this before. Then you should already know the answer, he cut, in his voice sharper now. You've been warned more than once to stay off Mr. Thompson's property. She swallowed hard, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. With all due respect, Sheriff, we're just here to ensure community safety. There have been reports of illegal construction and unregistered vehicles on this property. Reports, he repeated, his tone dipping. From who? You, Karen hesitated. Well, yes, as the HOA president, it's my duty to investigate. Brown's eyes narrowed. Investigate, you mean trespass, damage private property, and harass a county resident. A couple of the neighbors watching from across the fence snickered. Someone muttered, she's done for. Karen puffed up her chest, still trying to save face. You don't understand, Sheriff. This man has been disrespectful to the HOA for months. He's endangered the harmony of the neighborhood. I almost spit out my coffee laughing. Harmony? You mean the constant threats, fake fines, and letters in my mailbox? She shot me a glare so venomous it could have curdled milk. You've mocked the rules that keep this community safe. Brown raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Ma'am, I'll make this simple. You and your patrol team are in violation of several county laws, destruction of property, trespassing, and possible harassment. I strongly suggest you cooperate before this gets ugly. Stan nervously raised his hand. Sheriff, sir, I told her this wasn't a good idea. Karen spun on him. Stanley, not now. He flinched, muttering something under his breath about sleeping on the couch for a week. Brown sighed. All right, let's make this official. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is Sheriff Brown at the Thompson farm. Send 2 units for assistance. We've got a group of unauthorized individuals attempting to conduct an illegal inspection on private property. The color drained from Karen's face. You're calling backup for what were just volunteers. Volunteers who broke into private land, he said. That's still a crime, last I checked. Her voice went shrill. This is a misunderstanding. You can't arrest us for trying to help the community. Brown gave her a cold, level stare. Ma'am, I can arrest you for exactly what you did, breaking and entering destruction of property and impersonating an officer, if you don't drop the Patrol Act right now. That last line hit her like a bullet. Impers what we're not impersonating, he gestured at the men behind her. Reflective vests, radios, badges that say security enforcement vehicles labeled patrol. What does that look like to you, Don? The ex-security guard immediately tore off his vest and mumbled, I'm not with them. Marv dropped his clipboard like it was radioactive. Karen looked around and realized she was suddenly standing alone in her crusade. Her voice cracked, but she still tried to sound authoritative. This isn't over. I'll speak to my attorney, Good Brown said calmly. You'll need one. At that moment, the faint sound of sirens drifted through the warm afternoon air. Within minutes, 2 county cruisers pulled up, lights flashing red and blue against the golden fields. Deputies stepped out, hands resting on their belts, expressions professional but mildly amused. They could already tell this was going to be one for the books. Afternoon, Sheriff, one of them said. What's the situation? Brown nodded toward Karen. Group of self-declared HOA enforcers decided to break into Mr. Thompson's property, damaged the lock, trespassed, and attempted to conduct an unauthorized search. One deputy looked at Karen, who immediately put on her sweetest fake smile. Oh, it's all just a misunderstanding, officer. We're only ensuring compliance. The deputy smiled politely. Compliance with what, ma'am? She faltered. With community standards. The second deputy smirked. Community standards don't overrule county law, Stan muttered. Told you. Karen's composure cracked again. You can't treat us like criminals. I'm the HOA president, and I'm the sheriff, Brown said. Rank still matters in this county. The deputies began taking statements, snapping photos of the broken gate, and noting the witnesses standing nearby. One neighbor shouted from behind the fence, Hey Karen, is this part of the inspection package we pay for? A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Karen's cheeks turned bright red. She crossed her arms, standing rigid as a statue, refusing to speak further. Brown walked up beside me, hands resting easily on his belt. Well, Mike, I think we can safely say the HOA won't be bothering you for a while. I chuckled. Oh, I don't know, Sheriff. You know how weeds are. They always come back. He grinned. True, but next time I'll bring the herbicide. The tension slowly drained from the scene as the deputies collected the last bits of evidence. Stan and the others were allowed to leave after a stern warning, but Karen was asked to stay for further questioning. You could tell she wanted to scream, but her pride chained her in place. Brown turned to her one last time. Ma'am, consider this your final warning. If you or anyone from that HOA steps foot on this property again, you'll be facing real charges. Understood, Karen's voice came out thin and trembling. Crystal. The deputies loaded their reports and headed out. The convoy of white HOA trucks followed behind them, noticeably quieter than when they arrived. When the last vehicle disappeared over the hill, I finally exhaled and set my coffee down. The yard was a mess. Footprints, tire tracks, a broken gate, but the silence afterward was the sweetest thing I'd heard in weeks. Sheriff Brown joined me on the porch. He pulled off his hat, wiped his brow, and said, "You sure know how to keep life interesting." I laughed. I swear I didn't plan this one. He sat down beside me, cracking open a bottle of water. You know, Mike, I've dealt with all kinds, thieves, smugglers, even a guy who thought tax evasion was a sport. But HOA folks, they're something else. They believe in their own laws more than the real ones. Tell me about it, I said. I've got a drawer full of violations that don't mean a thing. We both looked toward the road, the dust still settling in the golden sunlight. For a moment, it felt like peace had finally returned. But then Brown's expression shifted, thoughtful, serious. He took a long sip of water and said quietly, "You know, this might actually help my investigation." I frowned. "Investigation, the one you mentioned before," he nodded. "Yeah. Turns out some of the HOA's financial records we've been tracking, the suspicious transactions they lead right back to this area." I raised an eyebrow. "You're saying Karen's involved?" He didn't answer right away. "Let's just say her name shows up more than once. This little stunt she pulled, it just gave me a reason to look closer." I leaned back in my chair, the sun warm on my face. "Well," I said with a smirk, "sounds like karma's not done with her yet." He smiled faintly, not by a long shot. As the sheriff gathered his things and walked back toward the guest house, I glanced toward the broken gate and thought about how quickly arrogance turns to downfall. Karen wanted a scene, and she got one. But she had no idea the real story was only just beginning. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. Missed calls, text messages, and a flood of notifications from neighbors I barely knew. When I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee, the sun was barely over the horizon, but the world was already wide awake and talking about yesterday. Apparently, the entire confrontation had gone viral. Someone from the crowd had posted the footage of the HOA patrol's inspection on Facebook, and within hours it had spread like wildfire. Every second was there Karen shouting, "Command stand," cutting the lock, and the glorious moment when Sheriff Brown walked out of my barn like a hero in a Western movie. The caption read, "HOA Karen tries to arrest farmer, real sheriff shows up instead." By 8 a.m. it had over 30,000 views. By noon, a local news outlet was already calling me for an interview. But I didn't answer. I didn't need to say a word. The internet was doing the talking for me. When Sheriff Brown walked over later that morning, coffee in hand, he had that sly half-smile that meant something was brewing. "You seen the video yet? Hard not to," I said, nodding toward my phone. "Half the county's already tagged me in it." He chuckled. "Karen's not taking it well. She called my office this morning claiming she was illegally ambushed on camera. Then she threatened to file a complaint with the county commissioner." I raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess." The commissioner laughed. "Pretty much," he said. "But it's not over yet. She's doubling down. Wants a full internal review of the sheriff's department." I took a sip of coffee. "She really doesn't know when to quit." Brown nodded. "Nope, and I think her stubbornness just might expose something bigger." He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and handed it to me. This came in late last night. Preliminary audit report from the county finance team. Turns out the HOA's been moving large amounts of money into a community improvement fund, but that account doesn't actually exist. I unfolded the paper. "You're saying they're laundering money," he nodded, "through shell donations and fake landscaping contracts. The treasurer signed off on most of it. And guess whose signature's on the authorization forms?" I looked down and there it was. Karen Whitmore. My jaw tightened. So all this time she's been screaming about community rules while she's robbing her own neighbors blind. "Looks that way," Brown said. "And that little show she pulled here, it's going to make my next warrant a whole lot easier." I couldn't help but grin. "You're saying her ego just helped build your case." "Exactly," he tapped the paper. "We just need one more thing, confirmation of how those funds were transferred. The treasurer's phone records the HOA's bank logs and the internal email chain. If we can prove intent, she's done." I looked out across my field, watching the sun break through the mist. "So what do you need from me? Just do what you do best," he said. "Stay calm. She's not finished making a fool of herself yet." He wasn't wrong. By that afternoon, Karen was back on the HOA's social media page posting a long, self-righteous statement. Yesterday's incident was a result of gross miscommunication. The HOA patrol acted in good faith to ensure community safety. The so-called sheriff's interference was unnecessary and politically motivated. Below that, she added another gem. We stand by our actions and will continue protecting this community against non-compliant individuals who threaten its harmony. The comments section was a war zone. Half the people mocked her, posting memes of her face next to police cars. Others tried defending her, claiming I staged the incident. Someone even made a parody account called HOA Justice League. But what Karen didn't realize was that her words were now evidence. Sheriff Brown screenshot everything and quietly passed it along to the county prosecutor. Later that evening, as I was fixing the broken gate, a car pulled up to my driveway. It was Stan, Karen's husband. He looked different. No swagger, no superiority. Just tired eyes and slumped shoulders. He stepped out holding a paper bag. "Peace offering," he said quietly, handing it to me. Inside were a dozen homemade biscuits. I chuckled. "Stan, I didn't peg you for a baker." He smiled faintly. "They're Karen's recipe. Figured I might as well make use of something she's good at." I raised an eyebrow. "She doesn't know you're here, does she?" He shook his head. "No, but I needed to say something, man. She's gone off the rails. Ever since she became HOA president, she's been obsessed with control. Every night she's up till midnight drafting enforcement notices. She thinks she's running a government. Sounds exhausting," I said. "It is," he sighed. "She's been spending HOA money like crazy, hiring contractors that don't exist, paying for community upgrades no one ever sees. I tried asking questions once and she bit my head off. Said it was classified." I glanced toward the road where the patrol trucks had driven off the day before. "You know, that might be more than just bad leadership, right?" He nodded slowly. "I figured as much. That's why I called her treasurer last week. Asked him about the missing funds. The next day, Karen had him resign. Said he was burned out, or silenced," I muttered. Stan hesitated, then looked me in the eye. "I know she's my wife, but if the sheriff needs proof, I can give it to him. I've got copies of her emails, bank receipts, the whole thing. She keeps everything on a flash drive, thinks she's too smart to get caught." I stared at him. "You serious? Dead serious? She doesn't even know I made backups. I just want this to stop." I called Brown immediately. Within 20 minutes, an unmarked county car pulled up. Stan handed the sheriff a small flash drive, no bigger than a thumb, and gave a brief statement. "This'll do it," Brown said, pocketing the drive. "With this, we've got her dead to rights." Stan just nodded. "I'll pack my bags tonight. She's not going to take this well." He left quietly, his tires crunching against the gravel as the sun dipped behind the hills. That night the farm was peaceful again. Crickets sang, and the soft glow of the porch light reflected off my coffee mug. But beneath that calm, I knew something big was coming. Karen wasn't the type to go down without a scene. And I was right. The next morning I woke to the sound of tires screeching. A black SUV was parked outside my gate, Karen's. She stormed out in yoga pants and a hoodie, hair, wild eyes blazing. "You think you've won, Mike," she shouted. "You think you can humiliate me and get away with it." I stayed on the porch, arms crossed. "Karen, I told you yesterday this isn't your jurisdiction." "You don't understand," she screamed. "You've ruined my reputation. My own husband betrayed me because of you," I frowned. "You did that all by yourself." Before she could answer, another vehicle pulled up, the same unmarked county car. Sheriff Brown stepped out, followed by 2 deputies. Karen froze mid-sentence. "Oh no. You're not doing this here, Karen Whitmore," Brown said calmly. "You're under investigation for financial misconduct, embezzlement of HOA funds, and obstruction of justice." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You have the right to remain silent," the deputy began, as he gently took her by the arm. Neighbors gathered again along the fence line, phones raised. Karen twisted, trying to pull away. "This is harassment. I'll sue all of you." Brown shook his head. "Ma'am, you've already sued yourself." As they led her to the car, the once mighty HOA president was silent. The only sound was the soft click of handcuffs. I stood there watching the morning breeze rustling through the trees. For the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. Brown looked over at me, his expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "Well, Mike, looks like justice finally caught up with her." I smiled faintly. "It usually does. It just takes the scenic route sometimes." He chuckled, putting his hat back on. "You'd be surprised how often it finds its way through people like you, stubborn, calm, and just crazy enough to record everything." The SUV pulled away, disappearing down the dusty road. The crowd dispersed. And for the first time since Karen moved into Cypress Ridge, the air finally felt clean. But little did I know this story wasn't quite over yet, because the more they dug into Karen's accounts, the more they'd discover that her HOA empire was hiding something much bigger than anyone expected. You'd think that with Karen in handcuffs, that would have been the end of it, the perfect ending to a ridiculous HOA saga. But as Sheriff Brown said that morning while watching her SUV disappear in a cloud of dust, some people build their own downfall, but Karen built an empire of it. 2 days after the arrest, I was back to my normal routine. The farm was peaceful again, no HOA trucks, no shouting, no drama. I fixed the gate one more time, repainted the lock post, and almost convinced myself life had gone back to normal. Then around noon, a black sedan pulled up. Out stepped Sheriff Brown, his deputy, and a woman in a dark suit carrying a briefcase. She looked like the type who could end careers with a single signature. "Morning," Mike Brown greeted. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by." "Not at all," I said. "What's going on?" Karen trying to soothe the clouds this time. He smiled faintly but didn't laugh. "Not quite. We need to talk about something we found in the investigation." The woman opened her briefcase, pulling out several sheets of printed spreadsheets, stamped and highlighted. "I'm Special Agent Leah Parker with the State Financial Crimes Division," she said smoothly. "Sheriff Brown mentioned you've been cooperative. I wanted to thank you for helping us expose what's now officially being treated as a multi-county fraud operation." I blinked. "Multi-county," she nodded. "Turns out your HOA wasn't just mismanaging a few dollars. They were laundering large sums through fake neighborhood associations, multiple ones across the state. Cypress Ridge was the hub." Brown chimed in. "Karen wasn't working alone, Mike. She was the face, the enforcer, but there's a network behind her. Developers, fake maintenance contractors, even a few county officials turning a blind eye. She made enemies higher up than she realized." I felt my stomach tighten. "And she had the nerve to send people onto my land," Agent Parker smiled grimly. "That's what arrogant people do when they think they're untouchable." Brown leaned on the fence post beside me. "The footage you got her leading that illegal patrol, shouting about authority in front of half the neighborhood, that was gold. The prosecutor said it's one of the best pieces of evidence they've ever had to show abuse of power and intent." "So what happens now?" I asked. Now Parker said we build the full case. We've already frozen HOA accounts. Stan handed over her flash drives. They're loaded with incriminating stuff. Meeting minutes, secret payments, even emails coordinating compliance checks that were really just intimidation tactics. I rubbed my chin. "Sounds like she ran her HOA like a mob." "Pretty much," Brown said. "And you were her first target that didn't fold." I sighed. "Figures." Parker closed her briefcase. "Sheriff, if you're done here, I'll head back to the station. The task force meets at 3. She turned to me. "Thank you again, Mr. Thompson. You may have saved a lot more people than you realize." When she left, Brown stayed behind. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from lack of sleep, but the kind that comes from seeing too much stupidity in one lifetime. He leaned against the porch railing. "You know, I think Karen really believed she was doing something noble. That's the scary part. She thought her HOA badge gave her divine authority." I nodded. "That's what happens when power doesn't have limits. You start believing your own lies." He smiled. "That's why I like you, Mike. You don't take anyone's nonsense. Keeps me grounded." We talked for a bit longer about crops, the weather, the investigation. Before he left, he looked toward the house where Karen used to live. "She's out on bail," he said. "Don't worry, she's not coming anywhere near you, judge's orders. But her lawyer's already spinning it as a misunderstanding." "Let her spin," I said. "The truth doesn't need a PR team." He chuckled, patted me on the shoulder, and drove off. That night I sat on the porch watching the sunset bleed across the horizon, thinking about everything that had happened. I wasn't one to gloat, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing justice wasn't blind after all. It was just patient. I thought about Karen's downfall. She'd built her HOA kingdom on intimidation, control, and money. But in the end, it wasn't a lawsuit, a protest, or even a scandal that took her down. It was her own arrogance. A week later, the full story hit the local news. HOA president arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Authorities confirmed that Cypress Ridge, HOA, and several affiliates were involved in laundering funds through fake development projects and maintenance contracts. The operation allegedly funneled hundreds of thousands in resident dues into personal accounts managed by HOA executives. There was even a picture of Karen being led out of the courthouse, face, pale hair, disheveled, her once perfect poise, replaced by disbelief. The comments under the article were brutal. I knew she was sketchy. She once fined me for having a blue mailbox. Finally, Karma HOA edition. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. But the real twist came 2 days later. Sheriff Brown called me early in the morning. "Mike," he said, "you're not going to believe this, but your name came up in the investigation." I froze. "My name, don't worry," he said quickly, "you're not in trouble. Actually, it's the opposite." He explained that several wire transfers made by the HOA treasurer were labeled as property acquisition reimbursements. One of those payments listed my farm address. Karen had forged a document claiming the HOA had partial maintenance rights to my land, the same fake authority she used as justification for her little inspection. I whistled. So she was trying to make it look official on paper. Exactly, Brown said. She thought if she could fake ownership records and make it look like your land fell under HOA responsibility, no one would question her trespassing. The county clerk's office confirmed those documents were completely fabricated. I exhaled slowly. She really went all in, huh? She did, he said. And that's why she's not just facing fraud anymore. We're adding forgery and falsifying public records to the list. She's done, Mike. Completely. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger or frustration, just closure. That weekend, I walked the property line with a new sense of peace. The sky was clear, the fences fixed, and the fields glowed golden under the sunlight. No HOA patrols, no flyers, no Karen, just quiet. As I reached the far end of my land near the creek, I noticed something half buried under a rock, a laminated HOA notice from months ago, faded and water-stained. It read, "Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in immediate enforcement action." I picked it up, laughed under my breath, and tossed it into the burn barrel. By the following Monday, the story had made state headlines. Karen's trial was being fast-tracked due to public attention. The prosecutor cited recorded evidence of authority abused my footage as one of the primary factors for indictment. The same clip that began as a humiliating HOA stunt had now become a symbol of justice. Reporters started calling it the daylight raid. They even interviewed some of the neighbors who witnessed it. One of them said, "On camera, we used to think the HOA protected us. Turns out, the real protector was the farmer next door." I didn't care much for praise, but hearing that made me smile. That night, Brown called again. "Thought you'd want to know Karen pled guilty to several charges. Looks like she struck a deal to name the others involved. The whole operation's about to come crashing down." I sat there in silence for a moment, letting it sink in. "You know, Sheriff," I said finally, "I almost feel sorry for her." He laughed softly. "Almost, yeah," I said. "She wanted control so badly she lost everything, her position, her reputation, her marriage. That's a heavy price for pride." Brown's tone turned reflective. "That's how corruption works. It doesn't start with greed, it starts with entitlement." He was right. The next morning, the sunrise painted the fields in gold. I poured a cup of coffee, leaned on the porch railing, and watched a couple of bluebirds land on the fence post. The quiet hum of life returned, no sirens, no shouting, just peace. And somewhere out there behind county jail walls, Karen Whitmore was finally learning that power without accountability always ends the same way, in silence. It's been 3 months since the daylight raid, and life on the farm has never been quieter. The fences are fixed, the crops are growing strong, and for the first time in years, the sound of wind rustling through the corn doesn't compete with HOA sirens or threats. The whole Karen incident feels like something that happened in another lifetime, one of those bizarre stories people tell at barbecues that nobody quite believes until they see the footage. But every now and then, something reminds me. Like this morning when the mail truck stopped at the end of my driveway, I half expected to see another HOA letter or some bogus fine. Instead, it was an official envelope from the county. Inside was a neatly typed notice confirming the dissolution of Cypress Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, signed and sealed by the county clerk. The HOA was gone. Officially. Permanently. I stood there for a moment, reading it twice, then a third time before laughing out loud. The woman who once bragged she ran the whole community had managed to destroy the entire organization from the inside out. Irony really is poetic. That same afternoon, Sheriff Brown dropped by one last time. He stepped out of his cruiser carrying 2 cups of coffee and a familiar grin. "Figured you might want to hear the final chapter," he said, handing me one. We sat on the porch together, the kind of quiet friendship that doesn't need words. He looked out across the field, sunlight glinting off his badge. "Well," he said, "finally it's official. The state wrapped up the case this morning. Karen pled guilty to fraud, falsifying documents, and obstruction. She'll serve 2 years minimum, maybe 3 if the judge isn't feeling generous." I took a slow sip of coffee. "And the others?" 2 board members turned on her, he said. "They cut deals in exchange for cooperation. The treasurer's already facing sentencing too. Turns out the HOA wasn't just laundering money, they were funneling resident dues into personal accounts for consulting fees. I whistled softly. So the HOA was basically a piggy bank. Exactly. And the kicker, most of those so-called community improvements, the new benches, landscaping, speed bumps, they never even existed. Just fake invoices. I shook my head. And she still thought she was the good guy. Brown leaned back in his chair. That's what makes people like her dangerous. They convince themselves they're righteous. Doesn't matter how wrong they are, they always think they're saving the world while stepping on everyone else. I stared out toward the horizon where the fields shimmered under the Sunday. She came after me because I wouldn't bend, because she couldn't stand someone she couldn't control. Yeah, he said. And that's why you beat her. You never fought her with anger, you just stood your ground. Calm, steady. People like that crumble when they realize intimidation doesn't work. We sat in silence for a moment. The air was warm, the cicadas loud in the distance. You know, Brown said after a while you became something of a legend around here. I laughed. A legend for what, locking my gate, he chuckled. For standing up to an HOA tyrant with nothing but a cup of coffee and a camera. Folks around town started calling you the farmer who beat the HOA. Even the county clerk mentioned it at the diner last week. Well, I said, grinning, I guess that's better than the guy who got fined for his fence. We both laughed. When he left later that afternoon, I watched his cruiser disappear down the road. The same road where Karen's HOA trucks once parked, the same one where she'd shouted about community safety. Now it was quiet, peaceful, free. A few days later, I attended the new community meeting at the town hall. Not because I had to, my land was still independent, but because the new residents had asked me to come. The HOA had been replaced with a voluntary neighborhood committee, one that actually listened to people instead of ruling over them. When I walked in, the room went silent for a second, then everyone smiled. A man I'd seen before, one of the neighbors who'd filmed the raid, stood and said, "Mike, we just wanted to say thank you. You taught us a lesson none of us will forget." I shook my head modestly. All I did was keep my lock closed. He laughed. "No, you did more than that. You showed us what happens when people stop questioning authority. You reminded us that rules only mean something when they're fair." That hit me harder than I expected. We spent the next hour talking about real improvements, fixing the park swing, helping the elderly couple at the end of the road repaint their fence, hosting monthly gatherings. It was community in the truest sense, without power trips or paperwork. As the meeting ended, one of the new board members, Linda, my neighbor who'd warned me months ago, handed me a framed photo. It was a still image from the viral video, Karen screaming at the gate while the sheriff stepped out of the barn hand on his badge. Beneath it, someone had added a caption in bold letters, "Respect boundaries." I laughed until my eyes watered. "You all are terrible," I said, wiping a tear. Maybe Linda said, "But you earned it." When I got home that night, I hung the photo in my barn right above the workbench. Every time I see it, I'm reminded of just how far arrogance can go and how far patience can take you. In the months since my life's gone back to its rhythm, the fields are greener, the animals calmer, and the quiet feels different now. It's not just silence, it's earned peace. Sometimes I still think about Karen. I wonder if in that gray cell, with no audience, no clipboard, and no control, she finally realized what she'd done. Maybe she did, maybe not. But either way, I learned something she never did. Power doesn't come from titles or rules. It comes from doing what's right, even when it's inconvenient. It comes from knowing where your boundaries are and defending them with integrity, not ego. And maybe, just maybe, it comes from keeping your sense of humor when chaos shows up at your gate with a clipboard. You see, folks, life will always have its Karens. The people who think authority gives them the right to step over others. They'll test your patience, challenge your peace, and sometimes make you question whether doing the right thing is even worth it. But here's the truth. Standing firm doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means waiting calmly, quietly, until the truth speaks for itself. When someone abuses their power, they're already digging their own hole. You don't have to push them in. You just have to make sure you're standing far enough away not to fall with them. So if someone tries to control your life, your work, or your peace, remember this story. Remember the farmer who faced down an HOA president, not with anger or revenge, but with a camera, a steady hand, and a sheriff who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Because justice doesn't always roar, it sometimes walks out of a barn in broad daylight and simply says, "You're trespassing." What about you? Have you ever dealt with a Karen who tried to cross the line? Tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories where karma comes knocking right on time.